I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Thank you for joining me today. It's my pleasure to be speaking with Roger Koppl, professor of finance in the Whitman School of Management of Syracuse University and a faculty fellow in the university's Forensic National Security Sciences Institute. His book, Expert Failure from Cambridge University Press, is an exploration of the cases and situations in which expertise does in fact fail and how we can best prevent that in our society. It's something that interested me as I've become more concerned about the ways expertise has been dismissed in some realms and praised in other realms where perhaps it shouldn't be. I was reading this alongside Thomas Nichols' The Death of Expertise, for example, and I think those two books and others really capture a moment in our contemporary history. I definitely encourage people to check it out. Roger, thank you very much for speaking with me today. I suppose that we should start with the basic question: what are experts? Particularly, how do you define expertise in this book? Because it may not be the same as a lot of other people.
In my theory, an expert is anyone paid for their opinion. This turns out, I think, to be an actual contribution of the book, is just to get the right definition of what an expert is. The pretty much universal way how people have defined an expert is by their expertise. But I think that just can't work. Think about it for a second. There's a division of labor. Different people do different things. Mm-hmm. Because there's division of labor, there's therefore a division of knowledge. Different people know different things. So everybody's in a unique spot in the division of labor. So everybody has unique knowledge about what's going on in their little corner of the division of labor. So everybody's an expert on something. Okay, but if everybody's an expert, nobody's an expert. And our definition of an expert in terms of his expertise just can't do any work for us. It can't support a theory of experts. So that's why my definition: an expert is anyone paid for their opinion.
As you came up with that, I think it's interesting because it opens up doors in some ways. Perhaps it changes the way that we think about it. But you're also coming from the point of view of a sort of field theory or an economic perspective of how the competition or lack thereof affects expertise. And you're not talking about, as you said, their actual expertise or their actual knowledge. You're talking about the situation in which the knowledge of the expert exists. And so can you say a little bit about how you went about conceptualizing that?
The way I'm defining an expert is a contractual rule. It's not like we'll line up all the people and then we'll pluck out the ones that are experts and the other ones are non-experts. No. An expert is a contractual rule. So like Steve Jobs, really seemed to have had some really deep insight about computing and about how humans interact with computers and so on. But in my book, he's not an expert, right? Because we didn't buy his opinions about the future and stuff from him. We bought his computers, we bought his, iPhones and so on. So I think that makes a difference. I don't have to as I think you were kind of saying in your question, I don't have to second guess whose expertise is right and whose expertise is wrong. And that's another sort of trap that people get into when they try to do a theory of experts. Second guessing the experts, distinguishing the true experts from, the cranks and the phonies. It's not an issue in my theory. Expert error, expert failure is an issue. But my theory doesn't require me to somehow decide whether your expertise is spurious or genuine.
Yeah, and in what ways did that help you working on this book? And if any ways, how did it hinder you?
Well, I don't think if it hindered me, I'm not aware of it. Every point of view has its limits, so there must be, the limits to this point. There are the limits to this point of view for this angle on experts. But I didn't feel it as a hindrance. On the contrary, I found it a liberation. It let me really sort of get to the positive theory of experts and expert failure that I finally came out with. It all really goes back to forensic science for reasons we can discuss if you like. I got into forensic science as an economist, that is, studying forensic science error. So I found myself studying forensic science experts and when the experts make errors. It would have been presumptuous and futile and absurd for me as an economist to come in and tell people, well, now this is see how you do DNA analysis correctly, or, when you're looking at fingerprints, that would be crazy. But I could say something about the fact that if we give a forensic scientist a monopoly right to evaluate some evidence, we're inviting a problem because we don't get a reality check on that forensic scientist's work. So it kind of just fell naturally out of my work on forensic science that I'm not second guessing the expert's expertise. And yet I might have something to say about when error is more likely and when less.
Yeah, and one of the interesting studies that you mentioned that you did yourself with colleagues, I believe, was, if I'm not mistaken, a situation in which you gave experts or people participating in this circles, triangles, and told them sort of to fill in, if I understand correctly, to fill in for the DNA results or for the forensic results that you're talking about. Can you maybe walk us through that? Because I think that is a great illustration of what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for asking me about that. That was a fun study. So as you said, I'm an economist. And when I started thinking about forensic science, the big problem that just kind of, was evident to me was this problem of monopoly.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a crime lab, we typically, the police, send evidence to you for evaluation. The chance that any other lab is going to look at that evidence is really quite low. It's not zero, but man, it's low.
Mm-hmm.
And really, also, the way things have been somehow set up or the way they came to be without anybody planning it, probably nobody else, no other forensic scientists besides the ones in your lab are going to interpret your results. So it's a twofold monopoly of test and interpretation. So I'm an economist. Monopoly is bad. And surprisingly, that sort of crude intuition that, hey, monopoly is bad, so maybe it's bad in this case too, plays out. You can't just go with spurious, shallow analogies. Oh, monopoly, therefore bad. You have to check it out and look in the details and see whether. But amazingly, it really proved true in this case. And I wanted to kind of put it to the test. How can I show in a controlled laboratory setting with human subjects that redundancy matters? Getting a second or third or a fourth opinion matters. Okay? And how many opinions do I need? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 4? So in the human subjects lab, we just kind of constructed this funny artificial world where one person is looking at one of 3 shapes, a triangle, a circle, or a square, and gives a report anonymously to another person who's told, and the report says either triangle, circle, or square. And then that second person is supposed to guess what did the first person actually see. So that, is a very simple setup. You wouldn't think there's a lot of scope for error. But we did kind of give randomly sometimes the first person an incentive to fit. Okay. So that if it's triangle and I say triangle and the second person guesses triangle, I get $1. But sometimes if it's a triangle and I say square and the second person guesses square, I'll get $5. So I kind of set it up so that sometimes people will make mistakes, okay, and they'll be rewarded for those mistakes. Unfortunately, that kind of describes the way it is in forensic science. Sometimes, actually quite a lot of times, forensic scientists can be rewarded for the mistakes they make, whether they're really honest errors or just kind of cheating. Either way, they kind of get rewarded. They get rewarded because they're in a lab that's organized under police. They're working for the police. And in fact, in many cases, the lab's budget depends on how many convictions they help to support. So they're so in a lot of labs, they're kind of working on commission, which is kind of astonishing and hard to wrap your head around. So the setup for our little experiment, circle, triangle, square, unfortunately reflects kind of how the system works. So I found out that if I just have one forensic scientist and one, juror or, one recipient of the forensic scientist's information, I got a lot of errors. If I have three forensic scientists giving independent opinions, it's very hard to make sure it's independent. That's a terribly important thing. But if I got 3 forensic scientists giving independent opinions, I get a much lower error rate. Okay? Adding a 4th and a 5th opinion doesn't seem to change anything. Adding just one more opinion isn't quite enough. Seems like you need 3. So there you have it. There I have a problem about the market for expert opinion. I go down to the structure of the market. Do I have one person giving the opinion or do I have 3 people giving the opinion? And I can test in a laboratory, I can test for the error rates because I know whether the first person saw a triangle or square or circle. So I know for sure, what the error rate is. Mm-hmm. And I come up with a conclusion. Oh, yeah, a little redundancy, little checks and balances would totally work. And in fact, 3 is the magic number in this case. 3 redundant tests, 1 original test and 2 subsequent redundant tests. That'll get you significant reduction in error rates.
It's a really simple and yet thought-provoking experiment that you mention in here. And it leads us, I guess, to see some of the possible errors. One being that there's this sort of blind, almost religious belief in forensic science or in DNA or in whatever sort of magic is going on in the lab that we don't get to see as lay people. But then you talk about how various market structures could help. What would help in terms of the market for experts more generally? So yeah, like if you could set up the best possible market based on the research, how might that look?
Oh, I definitely wouldn't do that. I wouldn't pretend to set up the best possible market. That's actually an important point. Look, let's think about what are the conditions that give you the best chance for expert failure, and what are the conditions that happily give you the lowest chance of expert failure.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of issues, and I go over them in the book, you saw. But there's two main really issues. Does the expert have a monopoly, or are they in some good sense competing? That poor word competition gets to mean so many different things, but in some sense you have competing experts. And then the other very important to mention is like who chooses? Is it the expert who chooses? Or is it the non-expert who's just getting advice from the expert? Okay. So I call it rule of experts when you've got a monopoly expert who's choosing for you. That's your biggest chance of expert error. And that's kind of what we have in forensic science, totally what we have in forensic science. So that's a pretty big chance of expert error there, unfortunately. Just the opposite of that would be, the experts only give you advice, and they're competing with each other. My big example of that is consumer reports. Mm-hmm. Thinking about buying a car or a toaster or a washer, you go to the experts at Consumer Reports. They'll give you their opinion. Just their opinion. You can flout their opinion. You can buy whatever toaster, car, or washing machine you want. Okay? And if their opinion starts to be not very good, if they become unreliable in the ordinary everyday sense, whether you can rely on their opinion, well, there's other, CNET, and there's Underwriters Limited, and there's, just any number of competing entities. So Consumer Reports, that's a warm fuzzy. Everybody loves Consumer Reports. It's got a great reputation. That's the situation when you have competing experts who are merely giving you advice and not choosing for you. That's autonomy, that's self-rule. That gives you the least chance of expert failure. That's kind of the theory of expert failure in a nutshell there.
Mm-hmm. And it makes perfect sense as you lay it out and as you get into more detail in the book, of course. But I find myself thinking about these two sort of extremes that, in a way, that you do highlight in the book. During Cold War Soviet rule, a centralized government with a monopoly of power, very little, if any, checks and balances, was definitely not the best place or the best use of expertise because no one was calling them on it. No one knew where it was coming from. The incentives were mostly to maintain power or to not get thrown in a prison camp or something.
Right.
You're not going to have an ideal situation in that. But then even just driving to my office today, I'm in a small town in Georgia, but on my way here, I see signs, bumper stickers that are definitely anti-science, racist in some cases, not the kind of people that I want to give autonomy to if they were going to make, say, voting laws. And yet I don't want to live in a fascist, autocratic rule. In some cases, I definitely do want somebody to tell me how to make a car. I don't want to let anyone decide how to make a car, right? How do we negotiate between the two extremes?
Well, I wonder what you mean when you say you don't want to let just anyone make a car. Why not? If someone starts making crummy cars, they won't be in the market very long.
Yeah, I guess I just don't want that process to play out. I'd rather have a group of people who are very good at engineering design a car. And if they were to try to explain it to me, other than the very basics, there are a lot of things that I know nothing about, and I could not judge the expertise. And I think, as you mentioned in the book, right, we're in a more and more complex society where that's often the case, that we're getting information that while we want to be informed citizens, some things like rocket science, for example, which is the sort of go-to cliche, right? Most people do not understand rocket science, and so they cannot judge the expertise of a rocket scientist. So in that way, I would rather have more of an autocratic rule, if you will, and I'm doing scare quotes here, because I want NASA or whatever expert to be making the decisions on rocket science. I don't want my neighbors, unless they have advanced engineering degrees, to be voting on which rocket to send into space and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it is kind of we're college professors. And so, we were just raised on hierarchical structures of knowledge. It's in the book and it's written down, and there's people who know better and people who know worse. And, the relevant knowledge is all embodied in some, expert. And the experts are even ranked on a hierarchy, who's at like the fancier school or received or did not receive a Nobel Prize or something like that. It's kind of normal for someone in our position in life to think that all the relevant knowledge of the world is in that form. And so you want like the smartest folks on the job. But the trouble is that humans aren't that smart. Even the smartest ones aren't that smart, I like to joke with my undergraduates, Albert Einstein was a moron. It's just that he was so much less of a moron than thee and me that we rightly celebrate his genius, but he's still a human and thus a moron. So if that's right, then somehow, if I'm right to question that model, it must be that not the relevant knowledge that actually makes things happen, like prevents bridges from falling down and so on, is, in the more modern world, it does depend more and more on science, but really only so much. It's distributed out among many different individuals, exists in many different forms, including just our habits, our traditions, our social structures. Let me give you an example. Look, the cover of my book shows the Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapsing. This is a famous case. There were winds that ran through the Narrows and produced vortices, little swirls of wind that caused the bridge to just start moving like in a wave pattern, up and down and up and down. So much so that the guys who built the construction workers, guys who built the bridge, called it Galloping Gertie because they could feel the thing going up and down. So almost immediately, or maybe immediately after it was open, people were worried that, okay, this thing's going to just fall down. And it did very soon. I forget, 9 months or something like that after it was opened. So there, what happened? You had somebody who had all the expertise about designing a bridge. They applied that expertise and the bridge fell down anyway. Now, think about a very different bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge. Okay? Roebling, the lead architect on the Brooklyn Bridge, knew that he didn't know much. So he made his proper, good, mid-19th century engineering calculations on how strong each component of the bridge had to be. And he looked at it and said, man, I know that I don't know much. So I'm just going to pick a number, 6. I'm going to make everything 6 times stronger than these design specs seem to indicate. Today, the Brooklyn Bridge is standing and carrying a heavier traffic than it was originally imagined it would. That's an expert I can warm up to, right? A humble expert who knows that his knowledge is weak. And that, I think, kind of carries a lesson for us. Don't rely on that bookish knowledge. Question that bookish knowledge. It's not that we want to throw it away. Roebling was an engineer. He needed his knowledge, his expertise as an engineer to build that bridge. But we have to recognize, I think, that the idea that somehow science can look ahead in the world and see all the relevant dimensions to even a technical problem like going to the moon and just like fix it is not a reliable idea. We managed to get to the moon, although people kind of forget we lost some folks along the way doing it, and we almost lost others in Apollo 13. But the Tacoma Narrows Bridge shows that oops doesn't always work that way. When talking about making a car, there's a lot of people making cars. There's different, the knowledge is out there in many different heads and firms and production processes. Let those different competitors compete and let folks like Consumer Reports tell you which cars are safer and which cars are not so safe. Think about, with cars, we've got the Highway Institute, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, crash test guys, okay? Well, yeah, it's the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, or whatever the correct name is. The insurers want safer cars, so there's a financial, economic interest in safety that's unambiguous for insurance companies, not so unambiguous for the automakers. But the insurance companies have an unambiguous interest, and they acted. They took, if I can use business school language, they were proactive in finding ways to rate and measure automotive safety. It's been a wonderful thing. Every year, the national news covers who came out well, who came out poorly in those crash tests. So here it's a decentralized process, not run by monopoly experts, that's giving us actually ever better, ever greater safety on the highways. That's a great model.
Yeah, that makes sense. Although there is certain standards that you have to meet before you get on the road, right? Like before you can say that your car is road ready or legally able to be on the road. Is that right? I mean, I'm not an expert.
well, look, in the automotive industry, as in every other industry in the U.S. and really the Western world, sure, there are a lot of regulations.
Well, I'd like to ask you about that then, because I like the metaphor of the turtles all the way down, right? If we have a regulator who is going to regulate the experts, then clearly we need someone to regulate that regulation. And so this can be turtles stacked all the way down, holding experts on experts, meta experts, and then meta experts. I know you want to, based on your book, sort of limit those kinds of regulations and make accessibility into the market as easy and simple as possible. But at the same time, there are regulations, like even in the automotive industry. How do you negotiate that?
Well, a couple of ways. I want to say sort of like preliminary remark, which way do you want to think about it? Do you want to think about hierarchical structures or distributed processes? I think what I found out studying economics, but also studying forensic science, is that distributed processes have a great potential to improve system performance. That hierarchical structures have a limited potential to improve system performance. Mm-hmm. How can I get away from hierarchical structures? When can I get away from hierarchical structures and toward distributed structures? Details matter. So I don't have a simple, recipe, 2-3 line recipe that'll fix everything. But I do have a disposition to look for distributed measures, to be suspicious of hierarchical measures. Mm-hmm. Well, let's put that to an application. Financial markets regulation. It seems pretty evident to a lot of people, and I'm one of them, I think, that there was a failure of regulation of the whole regulatory apparatus in the recent financial crisis, 2008. I think there was a failure in monetary policy, but I also think the rating agencies failed. Mm-hmm. Well, the rating agency, and a lot of people think that, the rating agencies were supposed to tell you what the risk of default is for different bonds, and they didn't do a very good job with those mortgage-backed securities. The rating agencies, though, those were creatures of the government. That was actually a hierarchical and not a distributed structure. How about if we do something that a couple of people have proposed, including a guy named Hans Stoll? Why don't we have competing regulatory agencies? So you, the bond issuer, choose who your regulator will be. And then that's like a brand name. These competing regulatory agencies, maybe they get their fees from regulating, from who comes to them to be their regulatory agency. That's, worth considering. That's a plan so that you've got regulation, actually. It's not just, the wild, wild west, but we have competing regulatory agencies, so we have a distributed and not a hierarchical structure. Then it gets much more, than choosing a bond for your municipal fund. It becomes much more like a householder choosing a toaster for their kitchen. You go to the shopping mall and buy a toaster. What happens? Well, first of all, there's Consumer Reports, which I mentioned before. It tells you what are the good toasters, what are the bad ones. You bought your toaster at, the Macy's department store. That's an assurance of quality. Macy's isn't going to sell you a toaster that you plug it in and it blows up on you. And you look right on the box and it says Underwriters Limited approved. So 3 times over, you can be pretty sure that toaster isn't going to blow up when you take it home and plug it in. Mm-hmm. Why can't we make our regulatory structures, when we do need government regulation of an industry, more like that? Well, maybe competing regulatory agencies could do that. Details matter. How are you going to work it out? It's again, I don't have a simple recipe, but I do have a direction to look for decentralized rather than hierarchical structures, okay, to give us good system outcomes instead of bad system outcomes.
And in many ways, and in many markets, I think that makes sense. I want to ask you about the media industry, because that's, personally something that I study and I'm interested in. But I'm thinking about it because the idea of a marketplace of ideas is, to some people, ideal, because if you say things that don't make sense, if you say things that are not truthful, then ideally people will flock away from you and towards the people that are more reliable, that are more honest and so forth in their news gathering and their decisions, right? We haven't necessarily seen that in America and other places. What we get in many cases are people tuning into the flashiest, most exhilarating news shows or something like that, that have very little to do with honesty, truth, and in fact are basically propaganda machines in many cases, which those things should have gone bankrupt, ideally, when you think about this competition of the marketplace of ideas, because the truth tellers, and you mentioned this in your book, and I know you say that truth is not actually necessarily what people are choosing based on, but why haven't media producers, news, journalism been as effective in showing us the value of this sort of marketplace of ideas? Why has it, in my opinion at least, kind of failed us?
Well, compared to what? Think of the old, you mentioned the Soviet Union at a certain point, as I did at a certain point in my book. Do you remember reading about Lysenkoism so they had this biology theory is crazy. And it was somehow built on Marxian dialectic. It was never taken seriously outside the Soviet Union. It didn't help them to grow better crops and have better agriculture as, was promised. But Lysenko sure had the ideologically correct biological theory. And the Soviet state said, this is the correct science theory. We're going with that. Okay. Now, in other directions, Soviet science was, fabulously successful. They had a space program that was ahead of ours for a long while and so on. But here there was a spectacular failure of Soviet science because there was no market for ideas. To say it was a controlled market is an understatement. You're totally right about fake news and all this stuff like that. It's really hard to figure out the truth about so many things. And the media is not helping us that much as we'd like them to help us. But the issue is how you're going to fix it. If you want to fix it by having the Bureau of Truth, that's going to make things worse. You can today listen to Pacifica Radio and, Rush Limbaugh, who have very different points of view. So each individual has on the web and on the radio and on the TV an opportunity for multiple points of view. So certainly just for each of us as a human, go get those multiple points of view. It's work though. It's true. You can't just be a kind of passive news consumer. That's true. And it's very hard to sort of dial up your skepticism, particularly for the news services whose editorial position is closest to your own views. So if for each of us as an individual, gee whiz, can you please dial up the skepticism? That would be great. So it's, the market for ideas doesn't work that well. But it's like democracy. Democracy doesn't work that well either. It is, in the famous quip of Winston Churchill, the worst possible system except for all the others. So the market for ideas is the worst possible thing except for all the alternatives.
I mean, what about incentives? You do talk a little bit about aligning incentives, and I'm wondering if you see any possibility. A complete free market for ideas has led, in some cases, to people following, I don't know, like the thing that comes to mind always for me lately is the Pizzagate thing, where people there was a marketplace for ideas. Rather than read or watch or listen to credible news sources, a significant enough amount of people tuned into or spread information that, of course, Hillary Clinton had a child sex ring in a pizza shop in a basement that didn't exist in Washington. Yeah. To the extent that someone from North Carolina came in and tried to find it and free the kids, and lo and behold, there's no kids. But that's just one of many examples of people. I mean, we have flat earthers, we have all of these kind of ridiculous things because of the free market of ideas. And of course, the complete opposite would be a top-down, like the state-sponsored marketplace of one, the monopoly. But what about incentives for truth? Like, do you see any possibility where, I don't know, maybe a state or maybe some kind of agency, without telling people you must do this or you must not do this, were to somehow reward or punish, whether that's through taxes or something, the idea of truth?
Well, the problem, of course, I mean, it's implicit in your question. The problem with any suggestion along that line is who's deciding what is and isn't the truth.
Yeah.
So, if you're going to somehow regulate it, you've got to solve that problem. But of course, the point is that we're looking, dimly through the fog, trying to apprehend the truth. And we have different points of view. So all of us, with no exceptions, have a partial perspective on the truth. So, if you can figure out some way to sort of, tweak or regulate the market, I'll listen. But I kind of doubt you can, because I don't think you get around this problem of who's going to decide what is and isn't the truth. Could there be some kind of a competing regulation idea, not unlike Hans Stoll's recommendation for competing financial regulators? Well, maybe. I kind of doubt it. And I'm a little scared of giving power to the state over a thing like that. I mean, after all that you said applies no less to religion. Huh? The Buddhists and the Hindus, the monotheistic religions, they can't all be right simultaneously. So, and that's very important. That concerns your morality and your eternal soul. The stakes are as high as they can be. Shall we then regulate religion? I think most Americans today would be like, no, maybe we don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect you personally would say, no, let's not do that. Well, if there's a regulatory scheme that's going to work for ordinary news, it would also work for religion. And if the problem is so great with the regulator of religion that we just want to leave it totally a free market, then probably for ordinary news, same thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting sort of thought experiment, regulating the media versus regulating religion.
Adam Smith, if you'll forgive me for jumping in.
No, go ahead.
Adam Smith, as I think I said in the book somewhere, he had kind of interesting perspective on that. Yeah, I did say this in the book somewhere. He's like, when you have competing faiths, okay, then this really encourages moderation. Moderate, not non-contentious views, no stridency to crush the infidel and so on. It's when you have a monopoly religion that you have this, the Inquisition and similar problems. It's a monopoly religion that most encourages fanaticism. So if we want, mild, moderate, amiable religion, maybe a free market for religion is probably the best idea. That was Adam Smith's idea. He had a very good point.
Yeah, so the idea that moderation would, in a sense, spontaneously occur because of these variations and because there is no monopoly makes sense. And I've seen this sort of studies where one person picking from a jar of beans or something doesn't get the right answer, but the right answer converges as many, many people give estimates, and it gets closer and closer. At the same time, though, it seems that at least political representations on television, on news media, have gotten more and more extreme, very sort of hardcore right and hardcore left, where you used to have moderate because of the extreme competition. So people are getting sort of louder on the sidelines and attracting people away from the middle. I mean, do you see it that way, or is there something that can sort of help us unpack that from an economic perspective?
No, I think you put your finger on an unsolved problem, but I also kind of think it matters what's at stake. Mm-hmm. Because all the polarization and the market for ideas gone wrong here that you described, it's in the political context. It's in the context of what the state is going to do, the government is going to do. Mm-hmm. So now, we have real resources being deployed to the benefit of some and the detriment of others. And people are scrapping. Mm-hmm. And that scrapping, that fighting, gets reflected also in the market for ideas. Whereas in religious competition, again, the stakes are high, and yet Smith's phrase was candor and moderation in religious views. Candor and moderation is what you get from religious competition. Right. Because if my soul is in peril, that does not imperil your soul. So we're not competing for resources and how they shall be used by the state to the detriment of one and benefit of another. There's no inherent conflict of interest between, what my religious views are and what your religious views are, for at least, the great preponderance of religions. Mm-hmm. So I think it matters the sort of domain where this failure has occurred. That's kind of why, as part of why the way I like to put it, I like to describe myself as do others who think similarly to me. I like to call myself a cosmopolitan liberal. Liberal in that old-fashioned sense of like free trade, free markets, free migration, limited government, the rule of law, meaning, everybody's obeying the same set of rules in the system. We don't privilege some over others. In that old-fashioned sort of Ben Franklin sense of liberal, I'm a cosmopolitan liberal. Cosmopolitan because you're a person, whether you're from around here or not. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I celebrate cosmopolitanism. Well, part of why I'm a cosmopolitan liberal is exactly this, that the more power we give to the state, especially to give in matters that touch deeply our several different value systems, the more danger we are in coming into violent conflict. I think the current failure of the market for ideas in sort of news and politics totally reflects the power of the state. That's maybe a reason to take away some of that power from the state.
Right at the end of your book, you conclude by saying that you hope to have induced in the reader a value of expertise, but also fear of expert power. I was wondering...
Value expertise, but fear expert power. Yes, yeah. I'm so glad you alluded to that. That's great.
Yeah, well, and maybe you could say a little bit more about that. So the main message of your book relates to that. How would you extrapolate a little bit, especially if anyone is, not necessarily familiar with the book yet?
Well, yeah, that is the lesson. Value expertise, but fear expert power. Both pieces of that are very important. I'm not anti-expert. how could you be anti-expert? You can't be anti-expert, right? Because we live in a complicated society with a highly, refined division of labor. Different people know different things. You can't somehow just deny expertise or stick your fingers in your ears and say, I won't listen to the experts and I'll do better, or something like that. No. You can't disvalue expertise. You must value expertise. It makes no sense. It's not a winning strategy, individually or collectively, to somehow trash expertise. So got to value expertise. But experts are people, and we should fear investing power in the hands of people. And that's kind of what that cosmopolitan liberal vision I tried to briefly articulate a few moments ago is all about. Fear expert power just as surely as you fear every other kind of power. I might note, sort of en passant, and I don't know if that kind of leapt out at you when you were reading through my book, I include in my, fear of power, fear of corporate power. In my Adam Smith, David Hume, F.A. Hayek tradition of liberalism, there is a tradition that fears corporate power and considers corporate power to be excessive today. A lot of economists will say, oh, no, Koppl, don't you know about the market for corporate control, this, that. The other thing, and they'll say, they'll just say I got it wrong, got my economics wrong. I argue in the book that I don't have my economics wrong there, that there is a problem of corporate power. Power from whatever quarter is to be resisted. Centralized measures, whether they be centralized in a corporate headquarters or in Congress, are to be feared. Decentralized systems are to be, in general, as a rule, with two exceptions, preferred. Decentralized, preferred to centralized. I don't know if that's addressing what you kind of wanted me to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, no, and that's a great summary or generalization of many of the topics that you cover in more detail in the book. And you give that example, actually, in the corporate chapter or section about a corporation, for argument's sake. I don't know the exact numbers, but if a corporation is owned by other corporations, or other corporations have, say, one corporation has a 20% stake, another one does, this can quickly lead to a sort of oligopolical, it's a concentration of power, let's say, but it's not concentrated in one monopoly, it's concentrated in a number, and so therefore it's dispersed. And I think more and more often in today's sort of neoliberal economy, we're seeing that where it's not one corporation or it's one person in the political sphere that has power. It's the conglomeration of a number of different ones that are working together. And so what kind of power ought we to think about, I guess, considering that a lot of places today hide power or they disperse power among a number of different places?
Well, I think it's kind of hard to work out sometimes when two different corporations are competing in such a way that each is a limit on the power of the other, and that helps keep us free. And when instead there's a problem of a kind of implicit collusion between them. So to really, work that out in concrete detail, I don't think that's a trivial matter. And the silly imaginary example I gave in the book, I was imagining three companies. Each company owns 30% of the stock of the other two. Okay. All right. So that means that as long as these three companies, the management of these three companies understand the situation, they're never going to sell their shares off to of the other corporations off to the general public. Because in this silly imaginary situation, each company would be 60% owned by the other two companies. So they're just freestanding. They're floating above the system. They're autonomous. There's a lot of reasons that's not a realistic example. So I wouldn't expect to see three real companies, in that situation. But that kind of gives you the logic of the problem of self-ownership among transnational corporations. A problem a researcher named Vitali and co-authors worked out. They say that nearly 4/10 of the control over the economic value of transnational corporations in the world is held via a complicated web of ownership relations by a group of 147 transnational corporations in the core, which has almost full control over itself. Moreover, 3/4 of the core are financial intermediaries. So it seems to me that, and I have not become aware of any significant critique of this result. And I think it's a very important result from Stefania Vitali and her co-authors, published in 2011 in PLOS One, for anybody who's disposed to kind of look that up. So when I look at Vitali's result, okay, first of all, I see a problem of corporate power, full stop. But also, I see that problem of corporate power being particularly, intimately related to finance. It is attributed to Lenin that what you need to do, Lenin supposedly said, although I've never found the real quote, is grab the commanding heights of industry, which in his days were things like steel mills. Well, the commanding heights of the economy today, that's the financial sector, which is a heavily regulated sector, starting with the existence of in my view, somewhat unfortunate central banking structure. So that's where I would look to work on the problem of how to mitigate this problem of obnoxious corporate power. If we had big corporations, but we didn't have this problem of sort of self-ownership that Vitali and others identified, so that they were really competing with one another by reasonable rules of competition, okay, then the fact that this corporation is big and that corporation is big, maybe not such a problem, as long as they're competing with each other. Ford is big, General Motors is big, Toyota is big, okay? But they're competing with each other. And boy, I can tell you, I'm old enough to personally testify, cars are a lot better than they used to be. So that's a case of big corporations. You might fear corporate power, and yet the competition is generating a good result. Better, safer, cheaper cars. But there's also a lot of political power held by corporations. How can we mitigate that? And right at the center of that, deeply at the core of that, forgive the pun, it's financial intermediation. So that's kind of where I'd look to for strategies to mitigate corporate power and make a freer world for everyone.
Yeah, well, and I'm just thinking about that as an example, right? So you give the sort of very basic example of 3 companies, 30% holdings of the other 2 companies each. And that nicely illustrates, and I totally got that example, I think. Then when you talk about the more detailed analysis, we're starting to throw out more numbers. And then if you really want to look into the holdings and track where this is going, we get into a very detailed situation that personally, and I think for most people, we have to rely on some kind of expertise to hold those other corporations accountable. So I'm wondering if you have any advice, I guess, for listeners or for readers to think through some of that.
I have a policy prescription, if I may share that.
Sure, let's hear it, yeah.
And I get it straight from the Nobel Prize winning economist F.A. Hayek, which is don't let one corporation own voting shares in another. I think your comment that you just made was sort of alluding to the terrible, tremendous complexity of these ownership relationships.
Which is no coincidence, right? This is not something that simply just happened, but something that I think happens for the benefit of certain people, like the owners, the major stakeholders, because I have no idea what I'm looking at if you were to show me a spreadsheet of that.
Well, yeah, I don't know how much it was all planned and how much they just sort of fell into it, but certainly at every step of the way, they're seeking out their own interests and not the interests of thee and me. So it's this terrible Gordian knot of interrelated ownership relationship, this very perplexing combination of sort of collusion and competition. And boy, it's enough to make your head ache for hours at a time. But Hayek had a simple, brilliant plan to cut the Gordian knot and put competing corporations on a truer basis of competition, make collusion, implicit or otherwise, more difficult. And that was, don't let one corporation own voting shares of another, period. How to really get that through national legislatures in this modern world, I don't know. That's a political challenge that's above my pay grade. But it would, I think, have a great salutary effect on markets, making them work more for you and me and less for a kind of managerial elite out there.
Yeah, and I think that, how would you say that might translate into other areas of expertise? Is there something parallel to that, not being able to own voting shares in other corporations? Would you see any parallels in other areas?
My suggestion is a competitive solution. So again, always I'm afraid of the hierarchical solution that vests hands in the power of one person or a small group of persons. And I lean much more always toward dispersed solutions in which you see power can be challenged and is contested. So, my suggestion, that we adopt Hayek's rule against one corporation owning voting shares of another corporation, that's moving toward a more decentralized, self-regulating system. You want a system that's self-regulating. Not so easy to get, but that's the goal. And so Hayek's proposal that I've been talking about here these last few minutes, that makes the market system more self-regulating. My proposals for redundancy in forensic science. In some sense, it's not a market solution at all. Forensic science is a state function. So I'm saying the state should set it up so that we have these multiple crime labs and so on and so on. So that's just true. But at another level, I'm proposing a kind of decentralized competitive system for forensic science. So always, always, always looking for those decentralized systems to make, well, forensic science or financial markets or the market for normal goods and services more competitive.
A detail to follow up on that. The idea of the competitive forensics market, would that be considered a regulatory approach, enforcing that, let's say, I don't know how it might look, but you have to consult with more than two forensic departments or something, which would end up possibly costing more, but maybe it's regulated that you have to consult with two more than the original first person? Or
well, yeah, I'll tell you in a minute why I think actually it would be cost saving. Yeah, I mean, so am I proposing a market solution or not? Oh heavens, what does that even mean? Forensic science is a state function. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's such a thing as the pure free market, even in principle. I don't know what that means, but let's say somehow there was the pure free market. Well, all right. Forensic science ain't in no pure free market because it's a state function. So, I think that might have been kind of implicit in your question, sort of putting a question mark on any idea of like a market for forensic science analysis. On the other hand, contestation is a real thing. And we can, through appropriate, state laws and policy and so on, create contestation of forensic science where now it's missing. And by the way, the really crucial thing on that for me actually is having a real and substantive defense right to forensic expertise. I come to the view that that's really the key to all other reforms in forensic science. Well, you go in a courtroom, you got a defense and you got a prosecution. Their interests are diametrically opposed. Whatever argument, whatever fact, information, argument might bear on the decision, let's say, of a jury, if we're talking about a jury trial, one side or the other has an incentive to bring it out. Every argument, every piece of information that might be, meaningful to the jury, influence how they decide. Okay. Well, it's going to, by definition, then that's going to help one side or the other. Mm-hmm. So if it hasn't come out yet, the side that it helps has an incentive to bring out that argument, that fact, that piece of information. So it is with forensic science. If there's some infirmity in the forensic science process before we get to the courtroom, that's either going to help the defense or the prosecution. One side or the other is going to have an incentive to bring out the infirmities of the forensic science system before the jury, to bring it out in the open court. Okay? Oh, well, but that becomes an incentive to fix those problems with forensic science. So the really crucial linchpin thing, we need a substantive right, defense right to expertise. You got a right to counsel, right? That's always on these TV cop shows. You have a right to an attorney and so on. Well, yeah, that's right. And we should have a similar right to forensic science expertise.
There's a lot I would love to talk about in terms of the history that you go over with the men of science of the Victorian era and the early legal proceedings, and even Socrates and early expertise. But I don't want to take up too much of your time. I want to.
May I just jump in?
Sure.
Is it okay if I jump in with a brief comment? I did forget to mention just a moment ago something that I think matters. Forensic tests are cheap. False convictions are expensive. So I did a study. I think it's probably cited in the book at some point. In 2010, I published a study where I showed that if you had redundant fingerprint exams, 2 extra ones beyond the initial one, it cost you about like another $100. Okay? And it would save you like $100,000 in the cost of incarcerating the wrongly convicted. So it turns out that, maybe it costs you another $100 for forensic science, but you're saving the criminal justice system $100,000. In other words, it's cost saving for the criminal justice system to have redundant forensic science testing.
Yeah, that's really interesting too, because it points to, I think, something similar with the economic crash and the situation of how to explain that is that the person whose job it is probably to oversee some of that testing is, unless I'm mistaken, probably not the person who has to deal with the lawsuit later of a wrongful conviction. And so both people could arguably be doing their job very well, but that oversight or that big picture can be missed easily without people like you and others doing research on and looking at that. But it is scary how people can be doing arguably the best job that they could in their specific niche. However, the big picture can be missed and there's a lot of intricacies in that.
Sometimes it's like the thing that's good about a human that leads them into expert failure. So if you're a forensic scientist and you're looking at two fingerprints and you're trying to decide if they match, and the issue is somebody stole my bicycle or my desk lamp, you're not that motivated to see a match there because it's a bicycle. Okay, that's bad. We don't want people stealing bicycles. It's not. What if it's a heinous double murder? All of a sudden, you're real motivated to see a match there where maybe there isn't a match. So it's that very human desire to, get the bad guy and make sure that, it's a safe society, stuff like that, that leads you to see a match that's actually not a legitimate match. Okay? So, yeah, it's funny how it works, right? Our very virtues may lead us astray. Or as you said, I'm doing, my job in what I think is the right, proper, good way, and yet somehow that leads to a bad outcome, such as a false conviction. Absolutely. Absolutely. That is somehow the human condition, isn't it?
Yeah, in our more and more complex society. Okay, so I want to ask you a sort of concrete question to bring it down to how you fit into this, because I paid money for your book. Your book is full of opinion or ideas that you're presenting, and therefore, by definition, you're an expert. I mean, for this podcast, I'm consulting. So when you say that you want to value expertise, you want readers of your book to end, among other things, by valuing expertise but fearing expert power. How do you fit into that? In what ways would you recommend, self-reflexively, that we value your expertise, but also that we are cautious of any expert power you may have?
Well, right. There's an economist I admire, a guy named Ludwig von Mises, was once asked, he was a big free market type guy. And he was asked, well, now, what would you do if you were made economic czar, or perhaps the word they used was dictator? What would be your first act if you controlled, all the decisions in the economy? And he responded unhesitatingly, my first act would be to resign.
Yeah.
I absolutely would encourage the audience. I hope the audience will take my arguments seriously. And I would be especially happy if they were to buy the book. So, of course, I want all that. I said my opinions because I think they're right. But, of course, I would also totally, in all earnestness, all jocularity aside, also encourage any reader to remain skeptical, to consider, to be reflective on what I say. I note in the book one of the great strengths of satire as an art form, as a literary form, which is that satire takes a kind of, skeptical view of human nature. But that creates, a problem because was the writer, immune from the infirmities of human beings that they're talking about in their work? Well, the satirical voice invites the reader to be just as skeptical of the author of the satiric work as the author is skeptical of their fellow humans. So, yeah, I would totally encourage any reader to take that same cautious attitude to what I say. But of course, I hope they'll take it seriously, too.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up our conversation, Roger. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me about your book, Expert Failure. And yeah, I'm going to definitely take under consideration what you've said and take it seriously, and at the same time be somewhat skeptical and looking for competing ideas.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Chris. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
As always, thank you very much for listening to This Is Not a Pipe podcast. Supporting it means a lot to me. I've had some wonderful discussions with people both on the podcast and afterwards or outside of it, and I hope those conversations can last a very long time. Be sure to check out tinapp.org to see Roger's recommended readings. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.